everybody, and welcome to today's video. We're going to be talking about horror today because it is nearly Halloween, and of course that means it is horror game season, and there are more than a few that have either been released or are just around the corner. I do have a review of quite a few of them coming on digitallydownloaded.net. I'll also be doing some more videos about them. The big one for me is, of course, Project Zero, Medan of Blackwater. That comes out soon enough, but I'm here to talk about House of Ashes today, but also more generally talk about the horror genre because it is one that fascinates me. It always has. I find that in the right hands, horror can be a very intelligent genre. People often dismiss it because they think it's about jump scares and gore and bad acting. They think about the worst of the B grade as kind of emblematic of the horror genre. But even that kind of B grade side of the horror genre has always had some fascinating philosophy and thinking behind it. I've studied it quite extensively when I was at university. I spent a couple of semesters looking at slasher horror, in particular Halloween and Friday the 13th. And even at that level, there is something very intelligent about the horror genre which has always fascinated me. It taps into the darker sides of humanity, of course. It's a little bit of a way of showing a mirror to the things that, as a society, we fear at the point in time that the horror is made. And that's why, as you look at horror over the generations, the stuff that is kind of turned into horror changes. So you had the gothic horror with the likes of Dracula and Frankenstein and those kinds of classic horror texts, and they were scary because that was what the society of the time was fearful of. And then you look at the 70s and 80s when the slasher horror came through, and society as a whole was, well, not as a whole, but a big part of society was concerned about I guess the liberalization of the youth and the increasing freedoms that they were looking for, and the kind of sexual revolution. So the horror genre was in a way a response to that, and so on. You look at the horror that gets made today, and you can also see it being reflective of the kind of things that as a society we're a bit frightened of. But that is to do more with, I guess, the film and literature genres, though. I think the thing with the horror genre in the games industry, it's not without exception, but overall, the horror that we play in video games is focused more on jump scares and action than it is about a kind of deep dive into the philosophy side of horror. But nonetheless, I do enjoy the horror games, and I have been playing this House of Ashes in the lead up to Embargo Lift. You can check out my review of the game on digitallydownloaded.net. But I think the thing I wanted to talk about in this video is that, and I'm trying to think of a nice way to put this, it's not that I didn't enjoy the game, because I did, and you can see the review score for that, but I guess House of Ashes isn't really scary to me, and I think in this video I'll kind of explore why, because it doesn't have to do with the lack of monsters or jump scares or things like that. It's more the way that this overall series has been designed that I'm starting to think is maybe this anthology idea that this developer hasn't got the legs that maybe they wanted it to. So the idea of the anthology is actually a really good one, and the developers have done a good job of presenting a series of different horror games in line with the concept of an anthology. If you're a fan of horror literature, then you're certainly aware of what an anthology is. It's a collection of stories usually written by different people that take you through a whole series of different types of horror. So you'll sit down with this book and have a lot of different ghostly tales or chilling tales to one after the other to really creep you out, and that was a lot of fun. And horror anthologies are certainly something that is iconic to this particular genre. So the idea of actually taking that and applying it to video games is a good one, and the developers have done their best to make sure that each of these games in this series is different as it would be in an anthology collection of stories. So the first one, which was Until Dawn, if you count that as a kind of prototype, I do personally, even though it doesn't have the Dark Pictures theme, but Until Dawn as the prototype was this B-grade slasher horror thing, which was certainly different to Man of Medan, which was the first in the Dark Pictures Anthology, which was a ghost ship story, and that was really great. And then the next one after that was set in Salem, Hope's Little Hope, and in being set in Salem, it had the kind of witchcraft and the thick fog that is kind of iconic with those stories. That was really good as well. For this new one, it takes place in the blistering sands of Iraq, which is very different again. It's not about the conflict between America and Iraq, even though it's kind of presented that way at the start. But what happens is soon enough everybody gets pulled into this forgotten temple from one of the earliest civilizations, or empires at least, one of the earliest empires that we have records of in the world. And they discover soon enough that this temple has been overrun by monsters from antiquity, and the game then becomes this story of survival about whether these people can work together, whether they're going to betray one another, how the relationships between the various characters affects how they're able to survive the horrors from underneath. And it is in itself a decent idea. I think the problem is not so much that the developers have these ideas of these games one to the next, because they are different and interesting. What the problem is they apply the same kind of gameplay to each of them, and that ends up affecting how you relate to these games in a way that's perhaps not the way that the developer intended on them. So each of these games plays out as a kind of point-and-click experience, really, with some quick-time events scattered liberally through them. In each case, you control one character, and it will shift between a couple of different characters' perspective depending on the point in the story that you're up to. But with that character that you control, you make your way around the world, you solve some puzzles. I wouldn't even call them puzzles, really. You just interact with the right places in the world that you need to progress the plot. And then every so often, something threatening will happen, at which point you need to go through a quick time event to see whether your character survives often, or at least gets through it unscathed. In between those, you're constantly being asked to make decisions, and they're binary decisions, or there's actually three. So you can choose one, you can choose course A, course B, or to not respond. So a character might say something to you, and you can decide what relationship you want to have with that character by picking to be hostile, to be friendly, to not respond to them, or whatever. And by doing so, you shift the needle about the relationship between these characters, and ultimately that decides which characters survive, which characters thrive. And it is possible to get through these games where everybody lives, but it's also possible to end up with a kind of total party wipeout and everybody dies at the hands of the monsters. Each game has had that same structure, and that worked really well for the first one, Medan. The whole structure of the game really did lend itself to that particular type of horror. The problem is with this one, this game wants to be more like an action horror game. It really lends itself to that. You see the monsters very early on. They're very powerful monsters. It's almost like The Mummy is the dominant aesthetic of this. And The Mummy, of course, was comedy action. It had its horror elements, but it really was this comedy and action thing. And the gameplay system that the developers have opted for with this, or for the series, doesn't lend itself well to action. Nobody enjoys doing quick time events too often. They do remove you from the action quite a lot. Quite frequently in this game, you do need to shoot enemies. And when you do, it works out almost like a QTE again, that you have a couple of moments to line your gun up with the enemy and press the right button. And if you do that in time, then you successfully shoot them. But it's not really the most viscerally exciting way of doing combat. So as a result, there is this distance that gets put between you and the action that's on screen. And while it is certainly cinematic, and I think the developers were aiming for that, there are some bugs, but the game is generally quite attractive and cinematic with the camera angles that they've used and stuff. But because they've put that distance in terms of the mechanics, they just get in the way of your ability to interact with the game with the way that the genre demands it to. So because of that, you don't really feel the intensity that you might have with a better designed horror game. And I think that does let House of Ashes down ultimately. I think if the developer wants to continue with this Dark Pictures Anthology, and I certainly hope they do, I had an interview with the developer in the lead up to release, and they did say that they had identified dozens of different types of horror that they would like to run through. If they do get to do more of them, and I do hope they do, I hope that they also take a look at the way that these games play and marry the gameplay up with the type of horror that they're trying to depict. If they are trying to do big action horror, like The Mummy, if they're trying to turn The Mummy into a video game with perhaps a little bit less comedy, but the same kind of aesthetic vibe and tone, if they're going for that big action, then they need a gameplay system that is more action-based. If they want to have a slower-paced horror, and certainly there are plenty of genres of horror that are quite slow-paced, if they want to have that, then they need to have a different type of gameplay. if down the track they make a Lovecraftian style horror, and I'm sure that's on the agenda, if they do that, then they're going to need to approach the gameplay differently again, because whereas in House of Ashes, showing the monster is part of the fear, in a Lovecraftian game, then you want to delay how long it is before you actually see the monster, because the mechanic there needs to be more about your character's sanity slowly draining away, because that was what Lovecraftian horror was about. You had these cosmic horror monsters that were just so far beyond the realm of human recognition that if we perceive them, they drive us mad. That's the kind of basis of Lovecraft's horror. So you can't approach a Lovecraftian game the same way you would approach Men of Medan or House of Ashes or any of the others. My concern is that these developers seem to think that they can take this gameplay system and apply it to each subgenre of horror equally, and I don't think that's going to work. I think this game is the first time that we've had that proven. That the first two worked with the gameplay system that they had. This third one needed a different approach. So once again, I did enjoy it. I thought House of Ashes was a lot of fun. I didn't think it was particularly scary. I don't think it was effective as a horror game, and I don't think the developers quite hit the brief here in terms of marrying gameplay and narrative up. So I still give it a positive review, as you can see on digitaldownloaded.net, but it does come with, I guess, the disclaimer that I'm a little bit concerned about the future of this series for the first time, because this one raised some red flags for me. Anyway, I'd be very interested to hear what you think about this. If you are a fan of the Dark Pictures Anthology, let me know in the comments. Do you think that the developers should be adjusting the gameplay to go with the type of horror that they're trying to share? If so, let me know what you think about this one. And also, what kind of horror games you'd like to see in this series going forward. Because I've got certainly some ideas about I've got ideas about what types of sub-horror I'd like to see them tackle, but who knows if they will. I'd like to hear your thoughts. If you did enjoy this video, please do it's been a long day. If you did enjoy this video, please do click that like and subscribe button. That way you won't miss any as I upload them. And if you want to support what we're doing on digitallydownloaded.net, you can directly. We do have a Patreon, which you can join for $1 a month. And if you do so, you do get a monthly magazine to go with everything else. You're supporting what we do on the website, this YouTube channel, and you get a 48-page magazine each month, which is a pretty good deal, I'd like to think. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Otherwise, we will see you at the next video.